Hi, patrons. Welcome back. Another video for you. Thank you, as always, for the continued support. For those of you who have reached out to me with kind words, I have a very special thank you for that. It is sometimes quite lonely saying a lot of the things that I say, especially at a time like this. I have very few friends and a lot of people who don't like some of the things that I say, depending on what side they might be on. But that's okay because I know that you're on my side, and that makes me feel great. And also, I know that in my heart, I'm telling the truth, and a lot of other people are not. And I think that as the weeks, months, and years go by, and people look back on this period, they will remember the people who told the truth and those who didn't. And anyway, that's just another way of saying that although I get a lot of hate from a lot of different quarters, I really, really get a lot of succor and sustenance from you guys. So thank you for that and for continuing to support me on Patreon. So, and a special thank you to Alexander, who sent me he sent me a number of different pieces to look at, but one in particular that I went through with extra care because I thought it was a good piece that really got into a lot of really critical issues that I've touched on in the broader context of Ukraine, Russia, Turkey competition, Central Asia, China, where it fits in. I've talked about a lot of these issues, but I haven't really honed in on one specific or two specific countries and really done a detailed analysis to illustrate a lot of the ideas that I'm talking about when it comes to Central Asia, especially Central Asia as a battleground between China, Russia, and Turkey, and of course, in the background, the United States and Europe, etc. But especially those three players, as they are clearly the influential powers on the Asian continent and in Central Asia, especially. So let's talk a little bit about two of those Central Asian former Soviet countries and talking through some of the differences between them, and most especially what we've seen in the post Soviet period and what we expect moving forward. And I'm talking about Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, I've talked about here a few times. I remember doing a video on Kazakhstan, Turkey, Russia, and this competition, but I think it bears repeating. Some of these issues are so deeply embedded in the fabric of, well, Kazakhstan as a country, but more broadly in the post Soviet space, that it does help us to understand, well, generally some of the problems that exist in the post 1991, region. So, or I guess post 1991 period within this region is what I'm trying to say. All right, so let's talk about Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Okay, again, both former Soviet republics, both of them seen as clearly the two most important countries in Central Asia. It's interesting because years ago there was talk about Turkmenistan as being important because of the energy that it supplies to China and other factors. But Turkmenistan has really proved to be something of a lesser regional player. Same is true for Kyrgyzstan, although that has kind of come and gone, especially in regards to NATO's Afghan war and the role that Kyrgyzstan played in that. But the two countries that really do dominate the region, both economically and militarily, are Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Both have remained linked very closely to Russia since 1991, and that is true in a number of respects. It's true with regard to energy exports. It's true with regard to infrastructure, energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure, businesses, business connections, financial connections. It's also true of education, the educational system. All of these things are rooted in the Soviet and immediate post Soviet period, to the point where these countries are very much enmeshed with Russia in myriad ways. Now, this is increasingly becoming a problem. As you can imagine, Russia is now to a large extent a global pariah. Certainly, Russia can't be depended on in the way that it had been in prior years from the Uzbek and Kazakh perspective. It can't be relied on to provide any of the kinds of investment or services or other things that might have been on offer were it not for the Ukraine war. So This then raises the question, to what extent are these countries now going to be looking at a window of opportunity to essentially break free of Russia's orbit? So, with that in mind, I'm looking at a very interesting article. This was in headline Uzbekistan's bumpy ride out of Russia's orbit. This comes from a well known Russia scholar, Stefan Hedlund, who, if you're not familiar with him, he's, I guess, one of the most prominent of the European Russia scholars. He teaches at the University of Uppsala in Sweden. I believe he's also at Stanford, and I forget, one or maybe one or two other places where he's his work appears. Anyway, Headland's article is a very good one because it goes into a lot of details about Uzbekistan, about how we should understand its development model, and the course that took it to this point. So, the question really begins with what replaces Russia as Russia declines in its economic capacity and its political, standing vis-a-vis the West, vis-a-vis investment. What is going to replace that? Well, the real question, I guess we could put it another way, is to what extent is a Western based model of development going to be the path versus a more Chinese like state investment model and in development model? In other words, are Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan going to follow the Chinese path or the Western path? And that is an open question even still, but let's talk through what that means. Now, to put it in the most obvious kind of liberal Western terminology, the real divide is between an authoritarian or autocratic model on the one hand and a liberal development model on the other hand, what you might call liberal democracy, to whatever extent we want to use that kind of term. The question again comes back to, is development predicated on a sort of democratic liberal order, a rules based order, as the West likes to say? Or can you have Chinese style economic development without that accompanying political development? This is not the first time this question has been raised, but it is an interesting one in the context of Central Asia because not only is China a model, but in fact, so is Singapore. Singapore is very much an authoritarian, maybe I guess we could say it was autocratic under Lee Kuan Yew. It is something of an authoritarian capitalist state, one that has achieved an extremely high level of economic and human development, and one that, to a large extent, is seen as a model in places like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. The question becomes, to what extent is the Singapore model, which is very much Southeast Asia, how can that actually apply to Central Asia, where the conditions are vastly different, where the type of economic products are different, the type of exports are different, the type of human capital is different, and the just in every way it is extremely different. So, can the Singapore model apply? Well, I guess the real question really is, will Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan follow one of these development models and then themselves serve as a model for the rest of the region? Can they develop economically without developing liberal democracy? That's one of the central questions in the article. It's one of the central questions at the heart of, trying to divine the future of Central Asia. So let's talk a little bit about these countries, about why they matter, and what happened in the post Soviet period. Well, they have obvious similarities. Both were led by strongman rulers that directly come out of the Soviet system in the Soviet period. In Kazakhstan, it was Nursultan Nazarbayev. Nazarbayev was the president and head of state really for the entire post Soviet period up until just a couple years ago in 2019, when, after sustained protests, he ultimately capitulated, stepped down from his position, and in his place, it's now Tokayev, who comes out of the same circles, who is in various ways part of this sort of Nazarbayev orbit. In Uzbekistan, you had a very similar trajectory. Islam Karimov, who was the president up until his death a few years ago in 2016, he had ruled from 1989, so actually even before the official end of the Soviet Union. So these two figures really dominated their respective countries all throughout the post Soviet period leading up to very recently. Economically speaking, these countries are extremely one dimensional, or in Uzbekistan's case, I guess, two dimensional. Kazakhstan's really primary economic output is energy that has been invested very heavily in by both the Chinese on the one hand and Western oil companies on the other hand. And so, again, Kazakhstan has this kind of multi vector approach over these last few decades where they kind of want to play both sides and do business both with East and West. But now that's increasingly under threat because you can't just operate in the new global environment in that way. This isn't the harmonious, globalized, neoliberal economic world of the visions of people like Larry Summers and whomever. We have now definitively broken from what we would call the globalized period, the global economic period, and now we're kind of breaking into a more regional oriented global economy where the regions themselves are interconnected, but new players within those regions, whether it's in the context of currency after the Russians were frozen out of Western sanctions, or if it's in any other context, say for instance linguistically, say for instance culturally, technologically, social media platforms, whatever it might be, we are seeing something of a fragmentation, a fracturing of the cohesive global order that was envisioned in the post Soviet period. So you have in Kazakhstan, primarily energy, in Uzbekistan, energy and cotton. So you really are looking at the energy sector and the textile sector. Those are the two that really figure centrally in discussions of these countries. Both of the countries are part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Both of the countries are Turkic speaking. So, this is something that I've talked about repeatedly in these videos leading up to now, is that there are economic and political ties that marry to some degree the former Soviet states of Central Asia with Russia, its former colonial power, and simultaneously cultural ties that really do connect them to Turkey way out to the west. Okay, these are part of what you would call the Turkic speaking or Turkic linguistic group. These are Turkic speaking peoples, whether Uzbeks or Kazakhs or Tajiks or whichever group you want to look at, they all are part of this sort of pan Turkic family. Now, remember back to Erdogan's philosophical orientation as being neo Ottoman in his outlook. That is to say, a reestablishment of Ottoman or Turkic influence over the former Turkic world. And just again, to back up, the Ottoman Empire was stripped piece by piece by the competing empires for a couple of centuries. Russia's acquisition of those territories was at the expense of the Ottoman Empire, whether it was in the Catherine the Great period or in the 19th century, in the Great Game period, or what have you. So, we are again coming back to certain historic tensions, ones that are centuries old. And now we see again, like for instance, in Kazakhstan, in the wake of the Soviet Union, when Kazakhstan was trying to sort of forge a national identity, they looked to Turkey, not to Russia, but to Turkey to help establish a formal Kazakh written language, to help establish what you might call a modern Kazakh identity. Same for the Uzbeks, although probably to a lesser extent. So Turkey is a major player here. And of course, we know Erdogan. Erdogan is a deft political operator, one who absolutely will look to exploit whatever divisions exist. Let's just talk about really quickly Uzbekistan before I come back to Kazakhstan. Uzbekistan is right in the middle of the region, double landlocked country, one that is without question the most populous country in the region. Although, if you look at the map, Kazakhstan looks so massive as compared to the other countries. It is, in fact, Uzbekistan that has by far the greater population, 34 million population as compared to Kazakhstan's, I believe, 19 million. So a lot of empty space in Kazakhstan. Um, the Uzbekistan is not only the most populous, it is the strongest militarily. They have invested heavily, relatively speaking, invested heavily in their military, and they have boasted pretty strong military capabilities. Just off the top of my head, without looking at any sources, I should double check this, but I believe Uzbekistan was a contributor to the NATO mission at one point, and Uzbekistan certainly did allow transit for NATO aircraft, NATO hardware, etc., during the 20-year criminal war in Afghanistan. So Uzbekistan, to that degree, has been a major player, but it is in opposition, or in I guess counter distinction to its neighbors with respect to Russia, where Uzbekistan has really distinguished itself. Uzbekistan, unlike all of these other former Soviet republics or countries, Uzbekistan declined to join the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO, which was Russia's kind of sort of answer to NATO. All these other countries participate, signed up for CSTO. Uzbekistan said no. Uzbekistan similarly said no when Russia, a number of years ago, created a so called Eurasian Economic Union as a kind of counterweight to the various economic integration programs that China was pursuing, but also economic integration, as we saw in Europe on the European continent. So the Eurasian Economic Union, Uzbekistan's not part of it. CSTO, Uzbekistan is not part of it. And we see what CSTO means. In Kazakhstan, in January, you had an uprising of workers, especially in some of those oil rich western cities in Kazakhstan, an uprising of workers who were demanding political, well, economic change, but also political change as a result initially of a dramatic increase in fuel prices, but ultimately that then snowballed into full-blown political protests demanding that the basically that the government resign, that there be new elections, etc. That was then forcibly suppressed by the Russians, who were called in under the auspices of CSTO, collective security, to put down this workers' uprising on behalf of the Tokayev government in Kazakhstan. Okay, so that's kind of one example of what CSTO means. Uzbekistan is not part of it. The current president of Uzbekistan is a guy named Shavkat Mirziyoyev. Mirziyoyev was the president since 2016 when Karimov, his predecessor, died. And he has actually been able to show relatively significant economic development. Now, that economic development, while it's been significant, has not really been coupled with political development, the development of anything resembling democracy. So that again brings us back to the central question that I began with, that Headland starts the article with, about the tension between an economic development model and a political democracy development model, and whether or not those two things can happen, I guess, distinctly from each other. All right. So they have retained in Uzbekistan, the Mirziyoyev government has retained the authoritarian nature of the government. And in many ways, they're sort of trying to replicate, to some degree, apply the Singapore model onto Uzbekistan in much the same way that in Kazakhstan they've attempted to do the same thing. And again, when I say the Singapore model, what I really mean is a sort of authoritarian style, capitalist, development oriented state. In other words, it's 100% capitalist. It is absolutely economically liberal, but politically very much authoritarian. That model, which has held true for Singapore for years and years now, that is what Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are really working towards. So you've had successful reforms of various kinds in Uzbekistan. You've seen the currency liberalized, which means, I mean, it means a lot of different things, but basically what it means is that the currency can float freely, can be exchanged for other currencies. It can be used in a global sense, not simply only within the country. You can exchange it for other currencies. You can exchange it for commodities and so forth. The borders have been opened. That basically means not the way that right wing lunatics in the United States say open borders. Open borders meaning freedom to travel, meaning the people of Uzbekistan are not, sequestered within their own country the way that they had been in under the previous regime, and especially the way that they had been in the Soviet period. You have the end of forced labor practices in the cotton industry. This was, and I mean, I'm not an expert on this. There are plenty of other papers you could read that go into this, but this was a major, major black eye for the country internationally. And of course, also just an extremely criminal and inhuman practice that had been continuing on. Public services in the country have improved. Media controls have been relaxed. There's more of a sense in Uzbekistan to, at least to some degree, one can speak freely and openly on political matters. One can question the authorities. Again, I say within certain confines. Of course, more freedom of speech. All of these things point to some of the indicators of what we would think of as a Western style liberalization program, and yet that's not really what's happening. And that dynamic, that distinction is really important to think about. Um, the Economist, which is, of course, nothing if not a right wing, capitalist mouthpiece, The Economist called Uzbekistan the quote country of the year for 2019. Mainly because of the extraordinary GDP growth that Uzbekistan had shown in the years prior. So they were averaging something around 5.5% GDP growth year to year, with topping out at 7.4% GDP growth just last year in 2021, which again, considering the stagnant nature of many economies globally, including the United States and China, that's a pretty astounding figure. All right, so talking about all of this, let me back up. Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan are important in and of themselves. The people of those countries are important to think about. The social dynamics, the economic situation, all of those things they matter in and of themselves, and they're important to understand in their own significance. But the global significance of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan really come into focus when we talk about the broader competition between Russia, China, and Turkey, and the United States and the West, I suppose. But that's a little bit more complicated because then we have to get into other issues. But just looking at China, Russia, and Turkey and the way that they're competing here, I've already mentioned the cultural ties with Turkey, talking about just the economic, the material ways in which this competition is evolving. We have a new freight cargo line, train line that was just opened last week or 2 weeks ago in Uzbekistan. And this freight line is actually connecting much of Central Asia in an east west fashion, much of Central Asia with the far east of China, Jiangsu province. In other words, a railroad, a cargo freight train that will connect, that will traverse the entire east. What am I trying to say? The entirety of China from east to west, and then across Xinjiang province and into the Central Asian republics, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan in particular, and Tajikistan. So this new train line is really important because it again reminds us just how important this region is for China and the Belt and Road. There can be no Belt and Road without Central Asia for a lot of reasons, one of which is that the northern route of the Belt and Road is now more or less in peril because of Russia's decision to invade Ukraine. Now, to the extent that Russia was even part of Belt and Road and the northern route of Belt and Road, that's more or less closed off now. And the southern route through these Central Asian countries is going to be even more critical. You have Uzbekistan now investing heavily in modernizing its energy infrastructure. Remember, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan both have energy production capabilities, but both of them are to varying degrees connected, intimately connected, sort of monopolized almost by Russia and reliance on Russia as their primary market for these exports. Uzbekistan has invested heavily in modernizing infrastructure away from Russia. Both Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan have, hinted at the idea that their energy might soon flow west via the Caspian, via Azerbaijan, through those pipelines, and to Turkey ultimately. Turkey, of course, having its own, energy issues, and also Turkey as something of a gateway to the European market. So, energy that might be right now really focused on this trade with Russia might soon shift away from Russia and head westward. That is why you're seeing Uzbekistan heavily investing in high speed rail. They're investing heavily in a number of different transport corridors, and especially a north south high speed rail that will ultimately, at least in theory, connect Uzbekistan with the Indian Ocean. And now, if you look at your map, you'll know that what we're really talking about is a high speed train line that would connect north south from Uzbekistan through Afghanistan into Pakistan and ultimately to the Indian Ocean, presumably the port of Gwadar, which is also controlled by the Chinese. So, that of course raises a whole set of other questions that I guess I might as well just get into them. Actually, no, I'm gonna hold off on those questions for 2 minutes. I want to just mention very quickly that corridor would, in theory, bring goods through Afghanistan to Pakistan, to the Indian Ocean, and to the world market. Yet another potential path for their energy and cotton exports and others to get to these world markets without having to go through an intermediary like Russia. Now, this, of course, raises a whole set of other questions. What does it mean for China? Well, number one, China is looking to re energize the Belt and Road. They desperately need that because it is stalling and stalling badly. China's economic growth is stalling. China's zero COVID policy is stifling its economic growth, from which they more or less can't turn back now because it would be a global humiliation for the Chinese. So, on the one hand, they desperately need to re energize the Belt and Road Initiative. On the other hand, the Chinese are also fighting against very strong anti Chinese sentiment in Central Asia. The Chinese are absolutely hated in Kazakhstan. They are hated in Uzbekistan for a lot of different reasons, one of which is historic. Remember that the Chinese have a historic dominion over some of those groups, including Kazakhs that are currently still in China, Kazakhs ethnically, and also the pernicious influence of Chinese culture on the Uyghurs, which again are very closely related to both Kazakhs and Uzbeks, Kazakh and Uzbek minorities inside of China. China as also a sort of dirty investor in these energy industries in these two countries. China has a lot of ground to make up when it comes to its reputation in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. There are other problems, of course, with Uzbekistan's path towards development, and Kazakhstan's for that matter. Number one, and I already kind of sort of was mentioning this a minute ago, and that is the disastrous potential of destabilization in Afghanistan. It's fairly clear now that Uzbekistan has invested heavily with the idea that the Taliban was going to come back to power, which they did, and would bring stability to the security situation in Afghanistan. That second part remains an open question. Imagine you're the Uzbek government and you're investing potentially billions in a corridor that connects your country and your country's goods with the world market through the Indian Ocean. You got to get through Afghanistan first. How are you going to get through Afghanistan if the security situation deteriorates? The Taliban, while they have obviously more control than the US puppet governments did, the Taliban does not control everything and certainly is in no position to make unequivocal guarantees of the safety of Uzbek, cargo and so forth. So the Afghan security situation is one big piece of this. The other piece of this is the social dynamics inside of these countries. While Uzbekistan has posted some pretty startling economic development numbers, it has not really gone very far in addressing some of the social problems in Uzbekistan. Same is true for Kazakhstan. I already mentioned the uprising in Kazakhstan earlier this year. Those workers are excruciatingly poor. They live on the margins. They live in extremely harsh conditions. The poverty is absolutely grinding, and there's no end in sight. Similarly, you have ethnic groups, ethnic tensions in both of these countries, especially in Uzbekistan. You recently had riots in a semi autonomous region known as Karakalpakstan. You have another similar semi autonomous region in Kazakhstan that has also seen unrest. Now, these regions don't necessarily mean that the entire country is going to explode overnight. The regions are fairly small. They don't represent a huge proportion of the overall population. I mean, the capital in Uzbekistan, in Tashkent, I mean, that outweighs pretty much the entire rest of the country in terms of population. But it does then speak to the growing instability that may come as these other global pressures begin to come to bear, including things like inflation, including, as I mentioned, the fragmented global situation, the lack of ability of the country like Uzbekistan to import all of the high value added imports it might need to develop some of these sectors. So these things are not without problems. Both of these countries seem to be on a path towards some kind of semi freedom from the chains of its Russian connections. At the same time, both of these countries are faced with very significant problems that really do threaten to sort of undo the social fabric. So the final thing I want to say is, I'm already past 30 minutes here, is that when we talk about the 19th century and we talk about the Great Game and Russia, Britain, the two empires really in competition to strip the bones of the Ottoman corpse, we are then also thinking about how such a great game would look in our day. So when we look at the history and we look at what's happening today, we have to see something of a continuation of some of these struggles. Obviously, it's different. Obviously, Turkey under Erdogan is not the Ottoman Empire of the 19th century. Obviously, China in 2022 is not China 4,000 years ago or whatever. I'm not trying to, make a silly point about history. I mean to say that some of the roots of these conflicts between these great powers go back several hundred years. And we do need to understand how this competition is shaping up in the here and now. Belt and Road sounds good. Neo-Ottomanism sounds good. Russian supremacy in its Soviet sphere of influence all sounds good when you're using these things for public consumption. But when they meet the cold, hard facts of reality, and we look at the situation, all of these countries have very significant problems. And these powers on the outside, they are looking to jockey with each other to position themselves to become a hegemonic force in Central Asia. Turkey wants to be the hegemon. Russia wants to be the hegemon. China wants to be the hegemon. Who will win? Will there be a competition? Will there be cooperation? Will it be a bit of both? Or, as seems to be the case to some degree, will these countries of Central Asia be able to say to all external powers, we develop in our own ways and we are independent? That remains to be seen. That's all the time I have for today. Thanks to Alexander for sending me that wonderful article. Thanks to all of you guys for continuing to support this work. And I will talk to you again next time.